This is the story of a man who conquered a continent, died certain he had earned a seat at the table of his gods, and found nothing waiting for him but grey fog and silence. His name was Sahn-Uzal, and what he did about that silence would take him 3 separate deaths, 2 full conquests of the mortal world, and 1 afterlife built entirely by his own hands out of the souls of everyone he had ever killed. If you are loving these videos and you genuinely fall asleep to them, then you have to subscribe. All right, tonight we are going to walk through all of it slowly. From the grasslands of a continent that had no name yet, to the fortress that still stands at the heart of Noxii, to the quiet realm beyond the veil where he sits right now, waiting. There is no hurry. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the story carry you down. Long before anyone drew a border across the eastern half of Valoran, before the word Noxii meant an empire or a capital or a threat, the land was known as the Great Grass Ocean. That was not a poetic exaggeration so much as an honest description. The plains ran flat and endless in every direction, wind moving through them in long, rolling swells that broke against the occasional stand of trees, the way water breaks against a reef. People lived out there in scattered tribes, and those tribes were called the Noxii. They were hard people, shaped by a hard place, and history remembers them mostly for their cruelty in war and their willingness to keep fighting long after any reasonable enemy would have stopped. Sahn-Uzal was born into that world millennia ago. The exact year is not recorded anywhere, and the people who might have kept such records were, in most cases, killed by him. What survives is the shape of the thing rather than the details, which is how legends usually reach us. A boy grew up among the Noxii. He reached adulthood. He took control of his tribe. And then, over a span of time nobody bothered to measure precisely, he took control of every other tribe he could reach. The faith he grew up inside is the piece of this story that matters most. And it is the piece most people skip past. The ancient Noxii believed in something they called the First Truth, and the First Truth was blunt in the way that everything about those people was blunt. The strong eat, and the weak have nothing to offer their gods. That was the whole of it. There was no mercy woven into it anywhere, no reward for restraint, no accounting for kindness. Strength was the only currency the gods were said to accept, and the payment was collected in the form of conquest. What that faith promised, at the far end of a life spent taking, was a place called the Hall of Bones. In the old tongue, it carried the name Osraknan. The idea was simple and enormously appealing to a warlord. Live strong enough, kill enough, dominate enough, and when your body finally gives out, the gods pull out a chair for you at their own table, and you eat with them forever. Not as a servant, not as a supplicant, as a peer. Eternity spent among gods, having proven yourself worthy of the seat. Sahn-Uzal believed that with his entire being. Every campaign he ran was, in his own understanding of it, a payment toward that seat. The burned settlement, the broken tribe, the field of dead men who had done nothing worse than live somewhere he wanted to walk through, all of it was tuition. He was buying his way into the Hall of Bones one massacre at a time, and by any measure his own religion offered. He was buying it at a rate nobody had ever matched. The northern wildlands fell to him tribe by tribe. Some he crushed outright, others folded into his war host, because the practical alternative was extinction, and the Noxii were nothing if not practical about survival. His people expanded until the distinction between a tribe and an army stopped meaning anything, and what he commanded was simply one enormous moving weight of men that rolled across the grass and absorbed whatever it touched. Eventually, even that stopped being enough of a description. The war host settled. What had been a wandering conquest became a kingdom, and Sahn-Uzal, who had started as the leader of one cruel tribe among many cruel tribes, became a sovereign. They called him the Unconquered King, and later, when the stories had travelled far enough to pick up embellishment, the tyrant of the great grass ocean. Both titles were accurate, neither was flattering, and he would not have cared either way. Dark faith drove all of it. That phrase gets used loosely, but in his case, it was literal. He was not conquering because he wanted land, or wealth, or the comfort of a throne. Those things arrived as byproducts. He was conquering because his religion told him that domination was the only thing the universe would ever count in his favor, and he intended to be counted higher than anyone who had come before him. So he crushed every tribe and every settlement that stood in his path, and he built an empire out of blood and death, and the years piled up behind him the way they do for everyone. That is the part the legends tend to leave out, because it does not fit the shape of a monster. Sahn-Uzal got old. His body wore down the same way anybody wears down, and the strongest man in the great grass ocean spent his final stretch of mortal life in the same slow arithmetic as the weakest one. He was not afraid of it. That is what makes the next part land the way it does. As his mortal life wound toward its end, he felt something closer to satisfaction than dread, because the accounting was finished and the numbers were overwhelming. Nobody had ever earned the seat more thoroughly. He had spent a lifetime paying, the debt was settled several times over, and all that remained was the collection. He lay down old and dying with the particular calm of a man who is certain about what happens next. And then he died, and he was wrong. There was no hall. There were no gods and no table, and no chair pulled out for him. What he found instead was an empty grey wasteland, flat and featureless in a way that must have felt like a cruel joke to a man who had spent his whole life on flat and featureless plains. Ethereal fog hung over everything. Discordant whispers moved through it without ever resolving into words. It was not a punishment exactly, because punishment would have required attention. And nothing about that place was paying attention to him at all. Occasionally other souls drifted past. They were barely there, ghostly shapes with no more substance than the fog around them, each one wandering through a personal oblivion that had nothing to do with anyone else's. They did not speak to him. They did not recognize him. The Unconquered King of the great grass ocean stood in the grey next to the ghost of a farmer he might have killed 60 years earlier, and the two of them were indistinguishable, and that was the entire point of the place. Everything he had built, every empire and title and monument to his own strength, had bought him precisely the same eternity as the men he had built it on top of. Anger arrived first. Not confusion, not grief, not the slow bargaining a smaller man might have done. Anger, he had been sold something, and it had not been delivered, and the two possibilities in front of him were both intolerable in different ways. Either the faith he had organized his entire existence around was simply false, in which case he had spent a lifetime paying into nothing, or the faith was real and the price had been higher than he understood, and his domination of the mortal world had not been enough to qualify. He never fully settled which one it was, and the honest answer is that it did not matter to him for long, because he rejected the premise of the question entirely. Souls are supposed to fade in that place. That is what the grey is for. The whispers wear you down, the shape of you thins out, and eventually there is nothing left with enough coherence to be called a person. Every soul that drifted past him was somewhere along that curve, sliding toward the end of itself without noticing, and the grey had been doing this efficiently for as long as there had been anyone to do it to. Sahn-Uzal did not fade. He refused, and the refusal held, and that single fact is the hinge on which every other part of this story turns. His rage kept him coherent when the fog should have dissolved him. His torment tempered his will instead of breaking it. Whatever the grey was designed to do to a person, it could not do to a man who was that angry about being there. So he stood in the wasteland, intact, furious, and completely alone, and he started paying attention. Time in that place does not work the way it works here, and none of the accounts agree on how long the next stretch took. What they agree on is what he did with it. He listened to the whispers. He kept listening while other souls came apart around him, and somewhere in that stretch of grey, the discordant noise stopped being noise and started being language. The dead have a tongue of their own. It is called Oknan, and it is not a thing the living are meant to hear, let alone learn. It belongs to the far side of the veil, and it carries meanings that mortal speech has no equipment to hold. Sahn-Uzal learned it the way a prisoner learns the sounds of the guards outside his cell, slowly and with total attention, because it was the only thing in the entire world that was still moving. Learning Oknun changed his situation from hopeless to merely difficult. The language of the dead is not just a way of talking to other ghosts, it is a key that fits the veil itself. A soul that speaks Oknun can push against the barrier between the realms and be heard on the other side. Not seen, not touched, not resurrected, but heard. And for a man in his position, that was a crack of light under a door that had been sealed for a very long time. He began to whisper. That is the word every account uses, and it is the right one. He could not shout, he could not appear, he could not force anything. All he could do was press his voice through the veil and let it arrive on the living side as something between a thought and a temptation, and hope that whoever caught it was ambitious enough to answer. What he whispered was an offer. His strength, which had never been matched by anyone in the world of the living, made available to whoever was willing to bring him back. He promised glory. He promised power. He promised the indomitable will that had already held together against an afterlife specifically engineered to dissolve it. And he sent that promise out across the veil, over and over, to anyone who dared listen. Nobody listened for a very long time. That is the part of the story that gets compressed into a sentence and deserves more than that. Centuries went by. The deeds of Sahn-Uzal, which had been the most consequential thing happening on the continent while he was alive, faded from history into legend, and from legend into the kind of half-remembered story an old woman tells to frighten children. The empire he had built either dissolved, or was inherited, or was simply forgotten. The great grass ocean kept rolling. New tribes rose in the same places the old ones had died. Not one of them knew his name. And through all of it, on the other side of the veil, he was still there, still coherent, still whispering into the dark and getting nothing back. Consider what that requires. Not the anger of a bad afternoon, but a rage stable enough to survive centuries of complete indifference. His soul remained, and it waited, and the waiting itself was a kind of achievement nobody in Runeterra would ever properly appreciate. What eventually opened the door for him was not his own doing at all. It was a catastrophe on the living side, and the catastrophe was the Great Darkin War. The details of that war belong to a different story, but the aftermath is the piece that matters here. Valoran was ravaged. The Darkin had torn through the world with weapons and ambitions on a scale that ordinary human politics could not answer, and when the fighting finally stopped, the continent that remained was a wreck. Populations were gutted. Old orders had collapsed. Knowledge had been burned or buried or simply lost along with the people who carried it. And into that vacuum stepped exactly the kind of person who is always produced by a ruined land, which is to say a person who has decided that the solution to catastrophic power is more catastrophic power. A coven of sorcerers picked up his whisper. They were power-hungry, they were fighting wars of their own in the wreckage, and they were looking for an edge that would settle those wars permanently. What they found, drifting across the Veil, was the promise of an ancient warlord who claimed he could not be beaten and who was apparently willing to work for whoever brought him home. They made the obvious calculation, and it was wrong in the way that these calculations are always wrong. They would resurrect him. They would bind him. He would be a weapon, and they would be the hands that held it. The logic is airtight, right up until you examine the assumption underneath it, which is that a man who spent centuries refusing to be dissolved by the afterlife itself would find a coven of opportunistic mages more persuasive than the void had been. There was a practical problem first. Sahn-Uzal had no body. He had been dead long enough that whatever had once been his flesh was gone past any hope of recovery, and a soul needs somewhere to sit if it is going to exist on the living side of the Veil. The sorcerers raised this as an obstacle. He answered it as an instruction. He told them to make him armor, not a body, not a construct in the shape of a man, but plates of dark metal shaped in the likeness of the armor he had worn as a warlord, built to hold a spirit the way a suit of steel holds a soldier. He guided the work through the Veil, and they did as he asked, because at that point in the process they still believed they were the ones giving orders. What they built was not a container. It was 2 layers of metal, a skeletal underframe of black iron, with the tarnished proto-Noxian plates fitted over the top of it, and the whole thing was made of iron and souls together, rather than iron alone. That distinction is easy to read past, and it explains everything about what he became. They did not forge a suit and put a ghost inside it. They forged a body out of the same material a ghost is made of, reinforced with metal, and the result was a hulking revenant, stronger than anything a mortal frame could have carried. Then they performed the binding, and the binding failed, and it failed for a reason so simple that it is almost funny. The spell required his name. That is how the binding of a spirit works. You hold the name, you hold the thing, and their whole plan was built on the assumption that they knew what to call him. So they screamed it into the ritual as the armor came alive in front of them. Sahn-Uzal, Sahn-Uzal, the name of the barbarian king of the Great Grass Ocean, the Unconquered King, the tyrant, and it did absolutely nothing, because Sahn-Uzal was no more. He had let the name go. Somewhere out there in the grey, across all those centuries of whispering into a veil that never answered, he had understood that the man who had died believing in the Hall of Bones was a fool and a mark, and he had discarded him. What remained had a new name, and it was not a name in any language the living used. It existed only in Oknan. It belonged to the dead. The armor stood up. Something ethereal rumbled through the chamber, and he spoke his own name in the language of the dead for the first time on the living side of the Veil. Mordekaiser, the sorcerers had roughly as long to appreciate their mistake as it takes to say the word. He killed them where they stood, and the killing was not an act of revenge so much as an act of collection. Because a soul that dies in the presence of a necromancer of his caliber does not simply leave. Their spirits came apart in terror, and as they dissipated he gathered the pieces and put them to work. He forged a weapon out of them, a mace, heavy and brutal, built from the fading souls of the men who had thought they were his masters, and he named it Nightfall. There is a specific cruelty in that choice that tells you everything about how his mind worked. He could have taken any weapon in the room. Instead, he made the sorcerers into the tool he would use to conquer the world they had wanted to rule, and then he carried them into every battle he ever fought afterward. The army was still there, of course. The coven had raised a war host for their own purposes, and that war host had been waiting outside for its new weapon to be delivered. It got one. Mordekaiser walked out of that chamber and took command of the entire force without a fight, because the men who might have objected had just watched what happened to the last people who tried to give him orders. His second conquest of the mortal realm began that day, and this time he was not a barbarian king with a big army and a bad religion. This time he was something the world had never seen. Understanding what changed between the first conquest and the second one requires understanding what he had actually brought back with him. The ambition was the same. The scale of it was the same. What was different was that he had spent centuries on the other side of the veil taking notes, and he returned holding necromantic sorcery that no living mage in Runeterra had ever imagined. Because no living mage had ever had the opportunity to study death from the inside for that long. The first thing he did with it was reach backward. Every soldier who had ever fallen in his service, every man who had died under his banner in the Great Grass Ocean centuries earlier, was still out there somewhere in the grey. He called them back. They came as shadows bound to his will, an army made of his own history, and the tactical advantage of that is hard to overstate. His enemies were fielding whatever men they could recruit from a continent still recovering from the Darkin War. He was fielding every soldier he had ever spent. The arithmetic of it gets worse from there, and this is where the second conquest becomes genuinely unwinnable rather than merely difficult. When someone was slain by Mordekaiser, or by anyone under his control. Their spirit did not go anywhere. It was bound to his will and folded into his army, and it did not matter in the slightest what that person had believed or fought for or died defending. A man who fell resisting him got up an hour later and marched with him. Previous allegiance was not a factor. Loyalty was not a factor. Killing his soldiers made him stronger, and so did losing his soldiers, and there was no configuration of the battlefield that did not end with him holding more than he started with. He did not stop at soldiers, either. A soul, once he had it, was raw material. He could take the spirit of a person he had killed and twist it into whatever shape suited him, and the shape was rarely human. Those were his soul constructs, and the people they had once been had no say in what they were rebuilt into. Then there were the things he brought with him from before. Atakan was one of them, and Atakan is worth pausing on. In the first life, when Sahn-Uzal was still flesh, Atakan had served him as a demonic servant, and the title it carried was the Bringer of Ruin. It had died somewhere along the way, or been sent back, or whatever the correct verb is for a demon leaving the material world. It had spent the intervening centuries in the spirit realm, presumably assuming that the arrangement was over. It was not over. Mordekaiser reached across and pulled it back as a beast of shadow and forced it into service a second time. And the word that survives in the accounts is forced. Atakan did not volunteer. It had never volunteered. It had been the possession of a barbarian king, and now it was the possession of the same king, wearing better armor, and the only thing that had changed about its situation was that escape had gotten considerably less likely. Somewhere in the same stretch, he acquired Tybolk. Tybolk was a fire demon, and the arrangement was the same as it was for everything else in his orbit, which is to say there was no arrangement. Mordekaiser bound it and pointed it at his mortal enemies and let it lay waste to them, and the demon did as it was told because the alternative was worse. That is the pattern that runs through his entire second reign, and it is the thing that separates him from an ordinary conqueror. Other warlords build coalitions. They make promises. They hand out land. They cultivate the loyalty of people who could plausibly leave. Mordekaiser did not have allies in any meaningful sense. He had property, and some of the property could talk. He did keep people close, though, a circle of acolytes gathered around him, living mages and scholars who performed dark magical rituals under his direction, and they occupied a strange middle position in his empire. They were not slaves, in the way his sole army was enslaved. They were not free either. They were useful, which in his accounting was a category all its own. And being useful brought them proximity and a share of the knowledge he was assembling. One of those acolytes was a pale sorceress. Her name, or at least the name history eventually attached to her, was LeBlanc, and she stood in his inner circle for years, helping him work rituals that no one else in the world would have survived attempting. Remember her. She has been standing quietly in the corner of this story for a while now, and she is going to end it. The empire he built with all of this lasted for generations. Not years, generations, which means people were born into his rule, lived their entire lives under it, and died of old age without ever having experienced anything else. Entire generations perished under his campaigns. It stretched across the eastern and central portions of Valoran, and to anyone standing outside it, the whole enterprise looked like nothing more than massacre for its own sake. An unstoppable engine of destruction rolling over the world, because destruction was what it was built to do. That reading was wrong, and it was wrong in a way that would not become clear for centuries. At the center of everything, he raised the Immortal Bastion. Most of the people living under him understood that structure the way you would expect. It was the seat of his power. It was the place the orders came from, the fortress at the heart of the empire, a monument in dark stone announcing that whatever had come before was finished, and this was the arrangement now. All of that was true. It was also the smallest part of what the Bastion actually was. Some came to know the secrets it held, and the secrets were the point. The Bastion was a library, and the subject of that library was death. He had been collecting since the moment he came back, and probably since before that. Everything he had learned in the grey, everything he pulled out of the souls he took. Every fragment of forbidden knowledge about spirits and the veil and the realms that sit beyond the one we can see, all of it went into that fortress. He hungered for knowledge with the same appetite he brought to conquest, and the two hungers were not separate. He was not researching death as a scholar researches a curiosity. He was researching it the way an engineer researches a bridge he intends to build. Because the thing to understand about Mordekaiser is that the Empire was never the goal. The Empire was funding. The conquest was a mechanism for acquiring souls and time and secrets, and every province he took was a province that could not stop him from doing the work he actually cared about. And the work he actually cared about was happening inside the Bastion, where almost nobody could see it. He had been told once that a seat at the gods' table was the highest thing a man could earn. He had earned it by every rule he had been given, and the universe had handed him fog. He was not going to make that mistake twice. If the afterlife would not give him what he was owed, he would find out exactly how the afterlife was assembled, and then he would build his own. That is the project. Everything else in his second reign is scaffolding around it. Along the way, the conquest crushed and enslaved everyone who stood against him, and among the people it crushed was an order of mages in the Noxii territories who had made the mistake of being interesting at the wrong moment. These mages were not warriors. That is what makes what happened to them land the way it does. In the ruined years after the Great Darkin War, with the land broken and the future looking like nothing much at all, they had turned their attention upward and renewed the study of ancient celestial magic. It was an act of hope. They were looking at the stars and trying to find some purpose in them, some indication that the wreckage around them was not the whole story. And they were doing it in a corner of the world that Mordekaiser considered his. He came through and he assessed them the way he assessed everything, which is to say he asked what they could do for him. The answer was almost nothing. They were unskilled in war. Celestial magic, whatever else it might be good for, was not going to break a shield wall. They were useless to him, and useless was the worst thing a person could be in his empire, and so he executed them. But before he did, he found something in among them that was not like the others. There was a Yordle among the mages, and his name was Veigar. Yordles are not from here. That is the first thing to hold on to, because the rest of this section does not work without it. They belong to Bandle City, a place that sits alongside the material world rather than inside it. And a Yordle in Runeterra is a visitor who can go home whenever the mood takes him. The door is always open. It is not a journey, it is barely even a decision. Homesickness is not a condition Yordles suffer from, because homesickness requires distance, and there is no distance involved. Veigar had wandered out of that door for the most Yordle reason there is, which is that he was curious. The celestial mages were studying something strange and beautiful, and he was drawn to their curiosity the way a moth is drawn to a lamp, and he imagined himself something of a master of the art. He probably was not. He was an innocent creature playing at wizardry among people who were desperately serious about it, and by every account that survives, he had never done anything to anyone. Mordekaiser looked at him and did not see a harmless oddity. He recognized the Yordle's crafty nature, which is a phrase that deserves attention because it means the calculation was not arbitrary. Everyone else in that order was executed for being useless. Veigar was kept for the opposite reason. He was imprisoned within the Immortal Bastion. And then, Mordekaiser did the thing that makes this the cruelest passage in his entire history, which is that he did not simply lock a door, he bound the Yordle to the physical plane. Think about what that actually means. Every other prisoner in that fortress was held by walls and chains, and walls and chains are things a prisoner can dream about getting past. Veigar's cage was the world itself. The one exit that had always been available to him, the door back to Bandle City that no lock in Runeterra could have closed, was severed. For a Yordle, that is the worst possible torture, and it is worse than any pain, because pain at least implies that something is happening to you. This was the removal of a thing so fundamental that Veigar would never have thought to name it before it was gone. He was tortured in the ordinary ways as well. That went on for a long time. Nobody records how long, and the honest answer is probably that nobody knows, because the person keeping track was the one inflicting it, and he did not consider it worth writing down. Eventually, Veigar's mind broke, and when it broke into the shape of the thing that had broken it. That is the part that has an unpleasant weight to it. Veigar did not come out of the Bastion as a victim who wanted to be left alone. He came out as a villain, and the villain he became was a small, loud, theatrical imitation of Mordekaiser himself. The obsession with power, the appetite for domination, the whole performance of evil that Veigar has been running ever since. All of it was learned in that fortress from the only teacher he had. He was enslaved to Mordekaiser's service and used to strengthen the Empire, and the thing the Empire took from him was not his labor, it was his personality. That is a rare kind of horror, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. Mordekaiser did not just conquer people. He conquered them so thoroughly that some of them started running his program on their own hardware long after he was gone, without ever quite understanding where they had picked it up. While that was happening inside the Bastion, something else was moving out on the eastern coast, and it is going to matter enormously. The cliffs along the eastern edge of Valoran were haunted. That is how the people who lived there described it, and they were not being metaphorical. Something lived in those cliffs. Something mythic and bloodthirsty that the local Noxii tribes had learned to treat as a god, because whatever else it was, it behaved the way their gods were supposed to behave. It demanded worship, and the worship it demanded was savage, and the tribute it wanted was young lives. They gave it what it wanted. That was the arrangement, and it had presumably been running for a very long time. The thing in the cliffs was Vladimir. Almost nobody was welcome in his lair. The tribes came to the edge of it, they left what they were told to leave, and they went home. And any deviation from that pattern ended badly for the person who deviated. He had been alive for a length of time that does not fit comfortably in a human sentence, and he had a history stretching back to ancient Camivore and a Darkin master whose army he had commanded as a young man. And none of that was known to the barbarians on his doorstep. To them, he was simply the god on the cliff who wanted children. Then, one day, the pale sorceress walked in. LeBlanc had been standing in Mordekaiser's inner circle watching the Empire work, and she had reached a conclusion that nobody else in that circle had the nerve to reach. Her master was going to be beaten. Not because someone would outfight him, since fighting him was demonstrably pointless, but because the arrangement had a seam in it somewhere, and she intended to be holding the knife when it opened. So she came to the barbarian god of the eastern cliffs with an offer, and he did not kill her, which by itself tells you the offer was interesting. The two of them feasted together as equals. That phrase appears in every telling, and it is doing a lot of work, because equals is not a status Vladimir extended, and it is not a status LeBlanc accepted from anyone. They sat at the same table, they ate, and they wove magic between them so dark that the room reacted to it. The wine in their cups soured while it sat there. The roses on the table withered, and as they withered the colour drained out of them, vibrant red turning to black. That is where the black rose comes from. Not a founding ceremony, not a manifesto, just two of the most dangerous entities on the continent discovering over dinner that they wanted the same thing, and a bowl of flowers dying quietly beside them while they talked. The pact between Vladimir and LeBlanc started at that table, and it has never ended. What they had agreed to do was end Mordekaiser, and the plan had 3 parts, and every part of it depended on somebody else doing the dying. The first part was the Noxii themselves. The tribes had been under the Iron Revenant for generations by this point, and generations of that will produce a particular kind of hatred, the patient kind that does not announce itself. What the tribes lacked was a reason to believe that rising up would accomplish anything other than adding their souls to his army. Vladimir was a god to them. LeBlanc had been at Mordekaiser's right hand and knew exactly how the machine worked. Between the two of them, they gave the Noxii the one thing that had been missing, which was a credible plan, and the tribes united. Rallying them was not a small piece of work. These were people who had spent their entire recorded history killing each other, and the only force that had ever managed to unite them was Mordekaiser, and he had done it by removing the option of not being united. Vladimir and LeBlanc had to do it by persuasion. They got it done, and the alliance they assembled marched on the fortress at the center of the world. The second part was the Immortal Bastion, and this is where the plan reveals how much LeBlanc actually understood. They did not go after Mordekaiser first. Going after Mordekaiser first would have been the mistake everyone else had made for 3 centuries. Instead, they went after the Bastion, because LeBlanc had stood inside it and she knew what it was. The fortress was the source of his power. Not symbolically, not politically, structurally. Whatever he had built in there, whatever apparatus he had assembled out of all that forbidden knowledge about spirits and death, and the realms beyond, it was the thing that made him what he was. And it could be neutralized. So they laid siege to it, and they neutralized it, and only then did they come for him. The third part was the ceiling, and it was the only part that had never been tried before. You cannot kill Mordekaiser. That had been established at considerable expense over 3 centuries. He had died once already, and it had made him stronger. And the whole architecture of the man was designed around the fact that the usual ending did not apply to him. His soul sat inside that armor, anchored there, and as long as the anchors held, he could take any amount of punishment the living world was capable of producing and simply keep walking. What LeBlanc and Vladimir did was sever the anchors. They did not destroy the armor, and they did not destroy the soul. They separated them. They cut the connections that held his spirit inside the iron. And the moment those connections gave way, the thing that had been standing in front of them stopped being a revenant and became two separate objects, neither of which was dangerous on its own. His soul was ripped out of the shell and cast out of the material realm entirely, back across the veil, back to the far side where it had come from. And the shell, the empty iron and souls that had been the most feared silhouette on the continent, was sealed away in a secret place. The reign of the Iron Revenant was over. It had lasted almost 3 centuries. The people who did it believed they had won. That is the reasonable thing to believe when you have taken an unkillable tyrant apart with your own hands and hidden the pieces. The Noxii tribes inherited the empire he had built, walls and roads and fortress and all, and they inherited it intact because he had spent 3 centuries constructing something durable enough to outlast anyone who tried to knock it down. LeBlanc took the bastion for herself, or as much of it as she could hold. Everyone involved understood the story to be finished. Here is what none of them knew. The betrayal had always been part of the plan, not her plan. His, Mordekaiser, had never fully trusted LeBlanc. He had never fully trusted anyone, which is not surprising given that his entire worldview was built on the premise that strength is the only thing that binds, and that anyone who is not currently useful is currently a liability. He had watched her the whole time she was watching him. He had understood exactly what she was, because she was the same thing he was, only smaller and more patient and considerably better at hiding it. And he had built his entire second reign around the expectation that one day she would move. That is why the Bastion existed. That is why the knowledge was collected. That is what all of it had been for. Because when they severed him from his armor and cast his soul out of the material realm, they did not send him back to the grey. There was no grey waiting for him this time. What Mordekaiser found on the other side of his second death was not an empty wasteland shrouded in fog and populated by dissolving strangers. It was a kingdom. His kingdom. Grand and eternal and finished, standing there ready for him, built out of blocks and mortar that he had molded from the souls of every single person he had killed during his second conquest. That is the reveal, and it recontextualizes the entire preceding 3 centuries. Every campaign, every massacre, every generation that perished under his rule, all of it was construction. He had not been conquering Valoran, he had been quarrying it. Each soul he took was material, and while the living world watched an empire rise on this side of the veil, the actual project was going up on the other side, where nobody could see it, and nobody could interfere, and nobody could take it away from him. He called it Mitna Rachnan. The name matters, because he had spent his mortal life chasing Osrachnan, the Hall of Bones, the seat at the god's table that the First Truth had promised him and never delivered. He did not get it. So he built the replacement himself, out of dead people, and he did not name it after the old promise. He gave it a name of its own in the language of the dead. And then he sat down in the middle of it as lord and master, and there was no god at that table because there was no table. There was only him. The souls he had claimed could not fade. That is the piece of this that should sit uncomfortably. The grey wasteland is a terrible destination, but it is a temporary one, because everyone in it is slowly coming apart, and the coming apart is a kind of mercy. Mordekaiser's dark magic perverted his souls so thoroughly that the mercy was no longer available to them. They were unfading. They were trapped in his afterlife forever, and forever in that sentence is not a figure of speech. he subjected them to fates worse than death, which is a strange phrase to use about people who are already dead, and yet there is no better way to describe it. The weakest of them were not tormented at all. They were used. They became literal building blocks, mortared into the walls and towers and spires of the place, and whatever remained of the person they had been remained inside the stone that was not stone. The ones he considered worthy did better, but only in the sense that they were still recognizably themselves. He would not let them speak unless he commanded it. He would not let them move unless he commanded it. A soul that had earned his respect by his own standards spent eternity standing exactly where it had been put, silent and still, until the day he had a use for it. His generals were expendable, and they could be spent, and dying for his sake was the only function they had. So the arrangement is this. On the living side of the Veil, an empire that had lasted 300 years came apart in a single siege, and the people who took it down congratulated each other and got on with the business of building a civilization on top of the ruins. On the other side, the man they had defeated walked into a completed palace made of their ancestors and closed the door behind him. And the only thing their victory had actually accomplished was moving him from the place he had been to the place he had been building the entire time. He remains there, not imprisoned, not banished in any sense that he would recognize, biding his time. The living world moved on without any idea what it had done, and the centuries that followed did him one enormous favor, which was that they forgot. LeBlanc understood the problem immediately, or at least she understood the piece of it she could see. Remnants of her master's magic still stirred in the world after the sealing, because she had taken his dark, arcane secrets for herself, and secrets like that do not sit quietly. She had a deception to protect. If anyone ever worked out that the pale sorceress, who helped save the tribes, had spent years as the tyrant's acolyte, learning at his side, taking his rituals and his knowledge and his fortress for her own use, the story of the liberation would look very different. So she did the same thing he had done, in her own way. She vanished into the pages of history. Then the Rune Wars came, and the Rune Wars were thorough. They devastated the continent and wiped out nearly every civilization on it, and in the process they burned away almost every record of LeBlanc's existence, which was the single luckiest thing that ever happened to her, and which she certainly did not object to. What survived was nothing more than old ephemeral legends. A pale sorceress once helped the Noxii tribes defeat Mordekaiser. That is the whole of it. No name that meant anything, no face, no account of where she had been standing before the siege started. In the centuries after the Rune Wars, she and Vladimir went back to work. They recruited, and what they recruited into grew from a pact between two monsters at a dinner table into a cabal of the most powerful mages in all of Runeterra. The Black Rose spread its influence outward, quietly, always in service of the interests of the people who could actually use magic, and it filled its visible ranks with greedy and powerless nobility who thought they were members and were in fact tools. That structure is still running. It is the oldest continuously operating conspiracy on the continent, and it dates back to the war against Mordekaiser, and most of the people inside it have no idea that is what they are for. They also kept the demons. After the defeat, LeBlanc and Vladimir hunted down and imprisoned Mordekaiser's bound servants, hoping to redirect them into the service of the Rose. It worked partially. Tybolc, the fire demon, eventually escaped the Rose entirely, and ended up tamed by a child named Annie Haster, which is one of the odder career arcs available to an ancient demon, and which is also a different story. Atakan did not escape. The Bringer of Ruin passed from Mordekaiser's will to LeBlanc's will, and it has stayed bound to her ever since, and it has never stopped wanting to be free. She uses it, At one point, she extracted the location of a darkened weapon hidden within the Temple of Twilight from it and dispatched it to Ionia to hunt the thing down, and the temple did not survive the visit. That is what Atachan is now, a tool passed between owners across thousands of years, and it has been someone's possession since before the Noxii had a written language. The Immortal Bastion is still standing. That is the detail that ought to make anyone in Noxus deeply uncomfortable, and almost nobody there thinks about it. The fortress at the center of the empire, the one the capital is built around, the seat of Noxian power that generals and grand generals have fought and schemed and killed to occupy, is his. He raised it. He filled it with forbidden knowledge about death and the Veil and the realms beyond. It was the source of his power and the engine of his actual project, and when he was cast out, the tribes simply moved in and started using it as a government building. And deep beneath it, LeBlanc hid the armor. That was not sentiment, it was strategy. She could have thrown it into the sea or scattered it, or buried it on a different continent, and instead she put it in a place she controls, underneath the fortress she took, because she has never once believed the story is over. She keeps the armor where she can see it. She plans for his eventual return, and she has been planning for it for a length of time that would qualify as the longest continuous project in human history if anyone knew about it. Her goal has never been containment. Containment is what she settled for, what she is actually doing, and has been doing since the roses turned black on that table, is seeking out new power so that when he comes back, she can destroy him permanently rather than merely inconvenience him for a few thousand years. She is not confident. That is the part worth noticing. LeBlanc is the most successful manipulator in the history of the continent. She has outlived every enemy she has ever had. She runs a secret order of the greatest mages alive from behind a face nobody can verify, and she has spent that entire career preparing for a fight she is not certain she can win. Her identity is kept secret even within her own organization. She can appear in any form. She uses illusions so routinely that there is a serious question about whether anyone has ever actually met her. And all of that machinery, every layer of it, exists in service of one goal, which is being strong enough when the iron finally moves again. Because she knows something the rest of Runeterra does not. She knows the ceiling did not kill him. She was there. She felt the anchors give way, and she watched the soul go. And she understood that going is not the same as ending. Everyone else on that battlefield walked away believing they had consigned him to oblivion. She walked away knowing she had bought time. One of her preparations is a girl named Rel. Rel can control metal. That is the whole reason she exists in the state she exists in, and the reason the Black Rose made her what they made her. The logic is not complicated once you see it. Mordekaiser is a soul wearing iron. Take away the iron and you take away the body, and a mage who can pull metal apart with her mind is the closest thing to a counter-weapon that has ever been designed for him. Rel was made for that purpose, in a program she did not consent to, by people who did not particularly care what it cost her. Whether it would work is an open question, and the honest answer is that it probably would not work well enough. Rel could very likely defeat his physical form. He is not aware of her, he does not know what she can do, and surprise is not a resource he has needed in a very long time. But breaking the armor does not break him. He would simply withdraw to the Death Realm and reform there, without the armor perhaps, and the fight would end with the Black Rose having spent its best weapon to inconvenience a man who owns an entire afterlife. That is the shape of the problem LeBlanc has been failing to solve for thousands of years. He does not have a body you can destroy. He has a location you cannot reach. There is a home base at the end of every path, and no army can get to it. That is what Mitnaroknan actually provides him, underneath all the horror of how it was built. Not comfort, not a throne, not the satisfaction of finally having the eternity he was promised. A position that cannot be attacked. Whatever happens to him in the material world, he goes home. And home is a fortress made of people, and there is no siege engine in Runeterra that can be pointed at it. Meanwhile, out in the world, the pieces keep moving without anyone in charge of them. There is a man named Yannick who wants him back. That is not a large or dramatic movement, and it is exactly the kind of thing that should worry people. Yannick went looking for the elixir of Uloa, which has the property of being able to resurrect Mordekaiser, and rather than seek it himself, he hired an explorer to fetch it for him. The explorer was Ezreal, who did not want anything to do with the Dreadlord, and who was not entirely clear on who the Dreadlord even was, and who took the job, because it looked like an easy sale. It did not go the way Yannick wanted. Ezreal handed over a fake vial, walked out, and helped himself to an old Oknan bell on the way, which is the sort of thing Ezreal does. So the resurrection did not happen, and the world kept turning, and the only thing that episode actually established is that there are people out there right now, ordinary living people, with no particular power, who are actively trying to bring him back, and who are only being stopped by luck, and by the fact that one of them hired the wrong courier. Every generation produces a coven. That is the lesson the sorcerers who forged his armor should have taught the world, and the world did not learn it. Because the world does not remember that it happened. There is another thing moving as well, further west, in the Shadow Isles. Veigar is out there, tearing holes in the world for reasons of his own, spreading a black mist across the continent and unmaking anyone it touches. It is the loudest catastrophe currently happening in Runeterra, and every power on the map has had to respond to it in some fashion. Whether Mordekaiser is aware of it is not confirmed anywhere, and the implication is that he is. He watches, and he waits, and if the ruined king succeeds in destabilizing the boundary between life and death across the entire world, that is not a threat to Mordekaiser's plans. That is a service performed on his behalf by someone he never had to recruit. Two kings of the dead, and they have never met. The comparison invites itself, and the answer is not close. If they came into direct conflict, Mordekaiser would very likely win, and the reason is not power in the raw sense. It is that Veigar is grieving. Everything the ruined king has ever done has been an attempt to get one specific person back, and grief makes you predictable. And predictable is a thing Mordekaiser has been exploiting since before Veigar's kingdom existed. Mordekaiser does not want anyone back. He does not want anything he cannot build himself out of raw materials he has already collected. There is no lever there for anyone to pull. There is one more piece to this, and it is quiet, and it is easy to miss. Kindred never came for him. Across all of Runeterra, when a life ends, the lamb and the wolf arrive. That is the arrangement, and it is not optional, and it is one of the few things in this world that appears to apply to everyone, regardless of what they believe or how strong they are. The dying are given a choice about how the ending goes, and then the ending goes, and kindred move on to the next one. Sahn-Uzal lay down dying in the Great Grass Ocean, the most accomplished killer the continent had ever produced, and nobody arrived. He went straight into the grey with no ceremony and no visitor and no offer of a good death. The most likely explanation is that his culture simply did not have a kindred myth. The Noxii believed in the first truth and the Hall of Bones and the God's Table. And they did not believe in a two-faced spirit who comes for everyone, and so no two-faced spirit came. Follow that thread for a moment, because it is the darkest implication in the entire story. He was never claimed. Whatever process is supposed to take a soul and put it where souls go, it never touched him, and he slipped through into a place that had no plan for him and no capacity to hold him. The grey wasteland was not a punishment designed for a tyrant. It was the absence of any design at all. He was a man who fell out of the system entirely because nobody had ever written a rule that covered him, and once he was out there, loose, furious, and unclaimed, he had all the time in the world to figure out how the machinery worked from the outside. Everything he has ever built came out of that gap. It is worth asking what is actually standing between Runeterra and his return, because the honest inventory is thinner than anyone would like. There is LeBlanc, who knows, and who has spent thousands of years preparing, and who is not sure she can do it. There is Vladimir, who knows, and who has an art gallery of his own victories, and has never seemed especially urgent about this one. There is Rel, who was manufactured as a countermeasure, and who could probably break his armor, and could not do anything about what is inside it. There are some ancient souls scattered across the world who remember the earlier conquests, and who fear the day he comes back, and fearing a day is not the same as being able to prevent it. That is the list. An immortal manipulator who is hiding from her own organization, a bored god on a cliff, a traumatized girl who was built rather than raised, and a handful of things old enough to be frightened. Against that stands the actual state of affairs, which is that he is not sealed in any meaningful sense. The armor is hidden, and hidden is not destroyed. And it is hidden in a specific building whose location everyone in the world knows. His soul is not imprisoned anywhere. It is at home, in a realm he owns, with an army that cannot leave, and cannot fade, and cannot say no. The elixir of Uloa exists somewhere, and it can resurrect him, and the last time somebody went after it, the only thing that stopped the attempt was an explorer who could not be bothered to do the job properly. Yarnock is presumably still out there. So is the elixir. So is whatever the next Yarnock decides to try. And the knowledge that beat him is gone. That is the part that should sit with you longest. LeBlanc and Vladimir did not defeat Mordekaiser with an army, they defeated him with a technique, and that technique required someone who had stood inside his inner circle for years, and understood how his soul was anchored. There will never be another person in that position. The Rune Wars burned the records. The empire that inherited his fortress does not know what it inherited. If he comes back tomorrow and LeBlanc's answer fails, there is no second method. Because the first method was never written down, and the only two people who know it are the ones who used it once and have been quietly worried ever since. Add to that the fact that the world is currently distracted. Noxus is busy with Noxus. Demacia is tearing itself apart over mages. The Shadow Isles are spilling black mist across the map, and every power on the continent is looking west at Veigar, who is loud and visible and comprehensible, and who is doing exactly the thing that makes Mordekaiser's eventual crossing easier. Nobody is watching the basement of the Immortal Bastion. There is no institution anywhere in Runeterra tasked with remembering him, because the only institution that remembers him is the Black Rose, and the Black Rose has spent its entire existence making sure nobody knows the Black Rose exists. So the answer to what is standing between the world and his final reign is essentially one woman's ongoing personal project, conducted in secret. Against a deadline she does not know, using methods she has already admitted are insufficient. He has time. He has always had time. The single greatest asset Mordekaiser possesses is not the mace or the armor or the army. It is the fact that he can afford to be wrong about the timing an unlimited number of times, and everyone opposing him has to be right once, forever. There is a phrase that follows him through every record that still exists, and it is worth taking apart slowly. because it is the most compact summary of his existence anyone has managed. Twice slain and thrice born. The counting is exact, and it repays attention. He was born once, as a child among the Noxii, in a world of grass and wind and casual violence. He was slain once, as an old man in his own bed, certain and satisfied, and completely mistaken about what came next. He was born a second time in a chamber full of sorcerers, as a spirit poured into metal, speaking a name that did not exist in any living language. He was slain a second time by the woman who had stood at his shoulder for years, at the foot of the fortress he had raised, with an army of the people he had ruled howling outside the walls. And he was born a third time on the other side of the veil, walking into a completed kingdom that had been waiting for him the entire time. 2 endings, 3 beginnings. The arithmetic runs in his favor, and it has never once run the other way, and that is not luck. Every one of those deaths was a transition he had already prepared for, and the only one that surprised him was the first. Few now remain who remember the earlier conquests. That is not an accident of time so much as a consequence of the Rune Wars, which erased the records, and of the Noxii, who inherited the empire and had no interest in advertising who had built it. What the modern world has instead are fragments. There is a Noxian calendar, and it contains snippets about the period, and those snippets carry the standard warning that comes with any Noxian account of anything. They may be incorrect. They may be biased. They are being told from the point of view of the people who took the fortress, about the man they took it from, across a gap of several thousand years, and every incentive in that arrangement points toward making the story smaller than it was. The version Noxus tells goes roughly like this. Sahn-Uzal deceived the mages who resurrected him and came back as Mordekaiser. He set about conquering the material realm from his Immortal Bastion. It took almost 3 centuries, but he was eventually defeated by an alliance of the Noxii tribes, who inherited the empire he had built. Read that carefully, and notice what is missing. LeBlanc is not in it. Vladimir is not in it. The Black Rose does not appear anywhere. The official history of the founding of Noxus is a story about brave tribes uniting to throw off a tyrant, and the 2 immortal monsters who actually engineered the whole operation have been edited out so completely that they exist only as an ephemeral legend about a pale sorceress that nobody takes seriously. That editing was deliberate. She did it herself, over centuries, and it worked. Notice something else. 3 centuries of the Iron Revenant compresses into 2 sentences in the calendar of the empire he founded. Generations of people lived and died under him and left nothing behind but a date range. The most consequential figure in the early history of Noxus is a footnote in Noxus, and the reason he is a footnote is that everyone with a reason to remember him accurately has been dead for thousands of years, and everyone with a reason to remember him inaccurately built the archive. Some ancient souls do remember. That is the part that keeps this from being purely a story about forgetting. There are things in Runeterra old enough to have watched it happen, and they know exactly what he was and exactly what he is capable of, and they are afraid of a specific day. Not afraid in the abstract, afraid of the day he decides to come back and claim dominion over both the living and the dead at the same time, which has been the plan since the moment he understood that the 2 things were not actually separate. Let us talk about what he looks like, because the physical fact of him carries meaning that the histories do not spell out. Mordekaiser appears as a massive suit of animated armor. There is no visible trace of humanity anywhere on it, no face behind a visor, no skin, no eyes in the sense that a living creature has eyes. What there is instead are 2 points of spectral teal light where a face would be, and those 2 lights are the only indication that anything is inside at all. The armor has 2 layers, Underneath, there is a skeletal underframe of black iron, shaped the way a skeleton is shaped, doing the job a skeleton does. Over the top of that sit the tarnished plates of proto-Noxian design, the ones he described to the sorcerers from the other side of the veil, copied from the armor a barbarian king wore thousands of years ago when he still had a body to put it on. And the whole thing is made of souls and iron together. Not iron with a soul in it, souls and iron alloyed, in a way that has no equivalent anywhere else in the world. That is why it holds him. A container would have failed. What they built was closer to a body than a suit, made of the same substance as the thing it was meant to carry, and the reason no weapon in 3 centuries could break him is that hitting him with steel was a category error. You cannot destroy a man by damaging his coffin, when the coffin is also his flesh. The weapon he carries is called Nightfall, and it is a mace, and it is made of the sorcerers. Everything about that decision is worth sitting with. He had just been resurrected. He was standing in a chamber surrounded by the corpses of the men who had done it, with an army outside waiting to be commanded, and the entire world unguarded in front of him after centuries of confinement. He could have picked up any weapon on the continent. Instead, he stopped, gathered the terrified fragments of the souls dissipating around him, and worked them into a mace fit for an Emperor of Death. There is a message in that, and the message is not subtle. Those men had wanted to use him. They had looked at the strongest thing they could find and thought of it as an instrument. So he made them into an instrument, permanently, and he carried them through every battle of a 300-year conquest, and every skull Nightfall broke was broken by the people who had thought they were holding the leash. His domain over souls extends further than most people realize, and each layer of it is worse than the last. He can control spectral energy directly, shaping it to whatever he wants, which is the baseline of what Ochnun gave him. He can bind his own soul into his armor, which is the trick that makes him a revenant rather than a ghost, and it is the only reason he can exist here at all. He can take the souls of anyone he or his servants kill and press them into service. And there is no allegiance strong enough to prevent it. And he can take a soul he has collected and twist it into any shape he desires, which means that a person who dies in front of him does not merely lose their life, they lose the shape of themselves and become an ingredient. Then there is the realm itself, and it sits at the top of that list because it is the one that changes the strategic picture entirely. By sheer force of will, he made a place for the dead to go, not found. Made, he and everyone he controls end up there when they leave the physical plane. Which means that killing his servants does not remove them from the board, it files them. And it means that killing him does not remove him either. That is the whole of it. Every ability he has is a variation on the same theme, which is that Mordekaiser has never accepted a single boundary the universe attempted to place around him. He was told strength earns a seat at the table, so he became strong. He was told the seat did not exist, so he refused to fade. He was told a soul cannot cross the veil, so he learned the language. He was told a spirit needs a body, so he had one forged. He was told his name would bind him, so he stopped having one. He was told death is where things end, so he built a city there. The only rule he has ever obeyed is the first truth, and he obeyed it so literally that he outgrew the gods who wrote it. Since we have the whole shape of it now, let us walk the timeline through one more time, slowly, from the beginning. There is nothing new coming. This is simply the story laid end to end, in order, the way it actually happened, rather than the way it gets told. It starts on the plains. The great grass ocean covers the north. Tribes called the Noxii live scattered across it, and a boy is born among them millennia ago with no indication that he is anything other than one more child in a hard place. He grows. He becomes the leader of his tribe, which is known even among the Noxii for cruelty and brutality in battle, and that is a low bar cleared in a competitive field. He believes what everyone around him believes. The strong eat, and the weak have nothing to offer their gods. Live by that, and Osraknan opens for you, the Hall of Bones, the God's Table, a seat for eternity among the only company worth keeping. He takes the promise entirely seriously, which is the part that decides everything. Because most people hold their religion loosely, and he did not hold his loosely at all. His tribe expands. Then it expands past the point where it makes sense to call it a tribe, and becomes a single army, and the army rolls across the grass absorbing whatever it meets. Eventually the movement stops, and the kingdom starts, and Sahn-Uzal becomes the sovereign of the north. The Unconquered King. The tyrant of the great grass ocean, he snaps every tribe that dares be in the northern wildlands underfoot, and forges an empire out of blood and death, and does it all as a payment on a debt he expects to collect. He gets old. He dies. There is no hall. The grey takes him instead. Empty wasteland, fog, whispers, and other souls drifting past on their way to being nothing at all. Anger arrives. He refuses to fade, and the refusal holds, and that is the moment everything else becomes possible. He listens to the whispers until they become Oknan. He learns the language of the dead, and with it comes the ability to press his voice against the veil. And he begins to whisper temptations across it, offering his indomitable strength to anyone who dares listen. Nobody answers. Centuries pass. His deeds fade into legend, and the legend fades into nothing much, and his soul waits. The Great Darkin War ravages Valoran. In the wreckage afterward, a coven of power-hungry sorcerers picks up his whisper and decides to use him as a weapon. He has no body, so he tells them to build one dark metal plates in the likeness of his old armor, and they do it. The result is a hulking revenant made of iron and souls, stronger than anything they had prepared for. They try to bind him with his name. They scream Sahn-Uzal into the ritual, and nothing happens, because Sahn-Uzal is no more. He speaks his own name in Oknan instead, and the name is Mordekaiser, and the sorcerers have about a second left. He kills them. He forges nightfall from their dissipating souls. He takes command of the army they raised, and his second conquest of the mortal realm begins. Empowered by necromantic sorcery he could not have imagined while he was alive. He raises the fallen soldiers of his own past as shadows bound to his will. He pulls Atakan, his old bringer of ruin, back from the spirit realm as a beast of shadow and forces it into service again. He binds the fire demon Tybalk and sends it to lay waste to his mortal foes. He gathers a circle of acolytes to perform his rituals. And one of them is a pale sorceress who will one day be called LeBlanc. At the center of it all, he raises the Immortal Bastion. To most people, it is a seat of power. To the few who learn otherwise, it is a vault of forbidden knowledge about spirits, death, and the realms beyond. And it is the reason the entire conquest is happening. He crushes an order of Noxii mages who had renewed the study of ancient celestial magic, looking for hope in the stars after the Darkin War left the land in ruins. They are unskilled in war, which makes them useless to him, and he executes them. Among them he finds a Yordle named Veigar, recognizes something crafty in him, and imprisons him in the Bastion instead, binding him to the physical plane so he can never reach Bandle City again. He tortures him until his mind breaks, and uses him to strengthen the Empire, and Veigar comes out the other side, imitating the man who destroyed him. Out on the eastern cliffs, a bloodthirsty fiend has been receiving young lives and savage worship from the local tribes who take him for a god. The pale sorceress walks into his lair with an offer. They feast as equals, they weave magic dark enough to sour the wine and turn the roses from red to black, and the black rose is born at that table. Vladimir and LeBlanc agree to end the Iron Revenant. They rally the Noxii barbarians, who have suffered under him for generations. They lay siege to the Immortal Bastion and neutralize the source of his power. They sever the anchors holding his soul inside the armor, cast him out of the material realm, and seal the empty iron shell away in a secret place. The reign ends after almost 3 centuries. The Noxii inherit the empire he built, and on the other side of the veil, he arrives not in the grey, but in Mitnarachnan. A grand and eternal afterworld built from blocks and mortar, moulded out of the souls he had claimed during the Second Conquest, standing finished and waiting, because he had known she would betray him from the start. LeBlanc vanishes into history to hide her deception. The Rune Wars burn the records. She and Vladimir imprison his demons. And Tybalk eventually escapes to be tamed by Annie, while Atakan stays bound to her will. They recruit for centuries and build the Black Rose into a cabal of the most powerful mages alive. She hides his armor deep beneath the bastion and starts looking for a way to kill him for real. Rel is one answer to that question. It is probably not a good enough answer. Yannick hunts for the elixir of Uloa and sends Ezreal to fetch it. Ezreal hands him a fake and walks off with an Oknan bell. Viego tears at the boundary between life and death in the west, while Mordekaiser watches and lets him work. And Mordekaiser remains in Mitnarachnan, ruling the unfading souls as lord and master, biding his time so he may return once more to begin his final reign over Runeterra. That is the whole of it, and every part of it was already decided before the sorcerers ever lit a candle. Before we finish, there are 2 stretches of this story that deserve a slower look. Because both of them are usually reduced to a single line, and both of them are where the real weight sits. The first is the grey. We have talked about it as a setting, a fog with some souls drifting through it. The disappointing thing he found instead of a hall. That undersells what he was actually standing in, and it undersells what he did there. Consider the theology he arrived with. The first truth was not a suggestion about how to live. It was a description of how the universe was supposed to be organized, and it was total. Strength earns. Weakness offers nothing. There is no clause about mercy, no allowance for the man who spares a village, no accounting for anything except the raw capacity to take. A civilization that believes that will produce exactly what the Noxii produced, which is people who understand kindness as a shortfall. Sahn-Uzal did not merely follow that. He completed it. Whatever the maximum score was, he set it, and the whole of his mortal life was an argument submitted to gods he had never seen, but had absolutely no doubt about. That is the psychological state he died in, and it explains why the wasteland hit him the way it did. He was not a man who lost a bet. He was a man who had performed flawlessly under the only rules he had ever been given, and then discovered the rules had never been connected to anything. And what was waiting was not hell. That is the piece people skip past every time. Hell would have been a compliment. Hell means the universe looked at you, evaluated you, and cared enough about what you did to arrange a response. What he got was a flat grey plane with nothing in it, exactly like the planes he had spent his life conquering. And the joke of that resemblance is so precise, it feels authored, even though nobody authored it. He had ruled an ocean of grass, and he was delivered to an ocean of fog, and the difference was that in the fog there was nobody left to conquer, and no way to tell one direction from another. The souls that drifted by were the proof. He could look at them and read the whole system in a glance. They were ghostly shapes, barely coherent, wandering their own personal oblivion. and not one of them was reacting to him, or to each other, or to anything. Whatever they had been, whatever they had done, whatever they had believed, it had all been rendered down to the same nothing. The oblivion was personal, which is a strange way to describe it, and it is the right way. Because it means no two souls in that place were even sharing an experience. Everyone was alone in a slightly different version of nowhere. That is the environment he refused to fade in. Think about the mechanics of that refusal for a moment, because they are worth appreciating. Fading is not an event you can resist by clenching. It is more like erosion. The whispers work on you, the fog works on you, and the shape of you thins out, a little at a time, until one day there is not enough left to notice that anything is happening. Every soul in that place was losing the argument slowly enough that none of them ever knew there was an argument. He knew. He held. His will was tempered by rage and torment rather than worn down by them. And that is not a phrase to skim past, because tempering is a metallurgical process. You do not temper steel by leaving it alone. You do it with heat and stress applied in exactly the right amounts, and the result is harder than what you started with. The grey was designed to dissolve people, and it accidentally forged the one thing it could not dissolve. Then came the listening, and the listening is the part that should genuinely unsettle anyone. He was surrounded by discordant whispers that meant nothing, and he attended to them for so long that they resolved into a language. That is not an act of power. It is an act of patience so extreme that it stops resembling patience. There was no guarantee the whispers were language. There was no reason to believe that learning them would help. There was nothing but a furious man in an empty place with nothing to do and an unwillingness to stop. And out of that came Oknan, and out of Oknan came everything else. And then the whispering back. Centuries of it. Pressing his voice through the veil into a world that had forgotten his name, offering his strength to anyone at all. And getting silence in return, over and over, for longer than most civilizations last. He kept doing it. There is no version of that story where he is not still doing it right now if the sorcerers had never listened, and that is the most frightening thing about him. Not what he did after he came back. The fact that he would have waited forever. The second stretch worth slowing down for is the reign itself, because 3 centuries is a long time, and it collapses into a sentence in every account. 300 years. Try to place that against anything familiar. A person born the day Mordekaiser took command of that first army could live a full life, have children, watch those children grow old and die, and the whole of that lineage would still be under him with no end in sight. It happened 4 or 5 times over. Entire family lines opened and closed inside his reign. Generations perished under his relentless campaigns, and the word generations is not rhetorical. It is a unit of measurement. And the measurement is that his empire outlasted the memory of anything before it. What that means practically is that at some point, everybody living in eastern and central Valoran had always lived under him. There was no elder who remembered otherwise. There was no story about the time before. Freedom was not a thing they had lost, because losing something requires having had it, and the people under his rule at the end had never possessed a single day of anything else. That is the most complete conquest available. He did not just take the land, he outlived the alternative. And the entire time the actual work was happening in the Bastion. Picture the arrangement from his side. The campaigns run themselves at a certain point. He has an army that grows every time it fights, generals who cannot refuse and cannot die in any way that inconveniences him. Demons bound to service, and an acolyte circle handling rituals. The conquest is maintenance. Meanwhile, in the fortress, he is doing the thing he came back for, which is dismantling the mechanics of death piece by piece and learning what it is actually made of. Nobody could help him with it. That is worth noting. The acolytes performed rituals under his direction. But direction is the operative word. Because none of them had been dead. None of them had stood in the grey. None of them had spent centuries learning a language nobody had ever taught. He was the only entity in the material world who had seen the far side of the veil from the inside and come back with his mind intact, and the research he was conducting had a sample size of 1, and the 1 was him. He collected obsessively. Everything about spirits, everything about death, everything about the realms beyond the one everyone else could see. All of it went into the Bastion, and none of it went anywhere else. He was building a working model, and once the model was good enough, he started construction, and the construction material was the population of a continent. That is what the massacres actually were. To his foes it looked like he cared only for massacre and destruction, and that reading was reasonable given the evidence available. And it was wrong. Every soul taken in 3 centuries of campaigning went across the veil and became architecture. The Empire on this side and the Empire on that side were rising at the same time out of the same raw material, and only one of them was ever meant to last. Now look at LeBlanc's position inside that, because it changes shape when you understand what she was standing next to. She served him for years. She was in the inner circle, performing dark magical rituals at his direction, close enough to see the pattern of it. And she is not stupid. She would have understood a considerable amount of what he was doing. She stole his arcane secrets, and they were good enough to found the Black Rose on, which means she got real substance out of that apprenticeship, and not just scraps. But she did not get the important part. She thought the Bastion was the source of his power, and she was right in the sense that mattered for the siege, and completely wrong about what the power was for. She thought that severing his soul from the armor and casting him out was an ending. She thought oblivion was on the other side of that door, because she had never been through it, and he had. That is the whole gap between them, and it has never closed. She has had thousands of years, an entire cabal of the most powerful mages alive, and every resource on the continent, and she is still working with a model of death that he obsoleted before her order existed. He is not hiding from her. He is not trapped by her. He is living in the thing she thinks she banished him to, and it is his, and she built it for him by pushing him into it. Unbeknownst to LeBlanc, her betrayal had always been part of his plan. She was not a variable he failed to control. She was a step. What is left is the question of what he actually accomplished, and the answer is stranger and larger than the body count suggests. Start with Noxus. The empire that stands in Eastern Valoran today, the one with the legions and the grand generals and the doctrine that strength is the only legitimate claim to anything, did not invent that philosophy. It inherited it. The first truth said the strong eat and the weak have nothing to offer their gods, and the Noxii who overthrew Mordekaiser carried that belief with them into the empire they took from him. And it never left. Strip the gods out of it and you have modern Noxian ideology almost word for word. They tore down the tyrant and kept his religion, and they have been running on it for thousands of years without ever noticing where it came from. They kept his fortress too. That is the more literal version of the same joke. The Immortal Bastion sits at the heart of Noxus Prime, and it is not a ruin or a monument or a preserved historical site. It is in use. It has been the center of power for every regime the Empire has produced. And the people who scheme and murder their way into it think of themselves as having reached the top of the Noxian world. They have reached the top of his. He raised those walls to house his research into death, and now they house a bureaucracy that has no idea the building was ever anything other than a headquarters. His armor is underneath them. That is not a metaphor. LeBlanc put it there, deep beneath the bastion, in a place she controls, and it has been sitting under the floor of Noxian power for the entire history of the Empire. Every ruler who has ever given an order from that fortress has been standing on top of the thing that built it. Then there is Veigar, and Veigar is the strangest legacy of all. Because Veigar is not a monument, he is a copy. The Yordle who walks around Runeterra today announcing his own evil, demanding to be taken seriously, building weapons of enormous destructive potential, and then failing to be feared by anyone, is running a program he did not write. He picked it up in a cell in the Immortal Bastion from the only source available to him during the years his mind was coming apart. He learned what power was supposed to look like from Mordekaiser, and when the pieces of him got put back together, that was the shape they went into. Everything Veigar has done since is a small tragic echo of a warlord who tortured him for the crime of being curious about stars. Mordekaiser is not aware of that and would not care. Veigar was a resource. The resource was used. That is the entire relationship, and the fact that the resource is still out there thousands of years later, performing an imitation of its owner, is not a thing the owner ever thought about. The pattern repeats everywhere you look. LeBlanc took his arcane secrets and built the most powerful magical organization on the continent out of them, and she is still using his methods to prepare for a fight against him. Vladimir walked away from that siege and kept living, and every great battle he has participated in since hangs as a painting in his gallery. And the one at the beginning of that collection is the one where he helped end a god he could not have beaten alone. Artakan changed hands and kept working. The tribes he crushed became an empire. The knowledge he collected became the seed of a cabal. He lost, and everything he touched kept running afterward on his design. Which brings us to the last question, and it is the one the ancient souls are afraid of. What does he actually want now? The answer is written plainly across every account, and it does not soften on examination. He intends to return, and the return is not an escape attempt or a revenge plot, or an effort to reclaim something that was taken from him. It is the next phase of a project that has been running without interruption since the day he refused to fade in the grey. He is building strength, not in the sense of gathering an army since he already has one, and not in the sense of preparing a weapon since he already carries one made of the men who thought they owned him. He is waiting for the arithmetic to be right. Time costs him nothing. Every person who dies anywhere in Runeterra is a potential addition to his holdings. Every disturbance in the boundary between the living and the dead makes the crossing easier. And everyone who might have remembered how he was beaten has been dead for so long that the technique itself has been lost. LeBlanc knows. Vladimir knows. That is two. And both of them have spent thousands of years being unable to solve the problem, and neither of them has told anyone else what is coming, because telling anyone would mean explaining where they were standing when it started. When he moves, he intends to lay waste to Noxus and reclaim the Immortal Bastion, because the Bastion is his, and everything in it is his, and the people currently using it are squatters in a building whose purpose they never understood. And after that, mankind and the strongest empires alike will have very little to offer him in the way of resistance. And he believes that with the same certainty he once believed in the Hall of Bones. The difference is that this time the belief is based on evidence. He calls it his final reign. Final, because there will be nothing left to conquer afterward. Not the mortal realm, and not the afterlife either, because to him, those were never two different places. They were one territory with a wall through the middle of it, and he has already taken the far side, and he has been standing at the wall for a long time deciding when to come back through. To Mordekaiser, Death was never an ending. It was a border he had not crossed yet. So we come back around to where this started, which is a man lying down to die on a plain of grass, satisfied, certain, and wrong. Everything that followed came out of that single moment of being wrong. If the Hall of Bones had been real, if the gods had pulled out a chair for him, Sahn-Uzal would have sat down and eaten, and the world would never have heard from him again. He would be a name in a Noxian calendar and nothing else. A barbarian king from the deep past who conquered some planes and then stopped existing. The way everyone stops existing. There would be no Iron Revenant, no Immortal Bastion, and no Noxus Prime built around it. No Nightfall, and no coven of sorcerers who made the worst calculation in recorded history. No Black Rose, because LeBlanc would have had no master to betray and Vladimir would still be sitting on his cliff collecting children. No Veigar, or rather a Veigar who wandered home to Bandle City after the Celestial Mages got bored of him. No Mordekaiser. An entire continent's history turns on the fact that one man's religion lied to him and he took it personally. That is the thing worth carrying away from all of this. Not the necromancy, and not the armor, and not the 3 centuries of massacre. The refusal. He was given the same ending everyone gets, in the same grey place, on the same terms. And every other soul in that fog accepted it, because accepting it is what souls do. He did not. He stood there in an eternity specifically built to erase him, and decided that the arrangement was unacceptable, and then he spent centuries doing something about it, and by the end he had not just escaped the fog. He had made his own. He is there now. Sitting in the middle of a kingdom made out of people, in silence, because none of them are permitted to speak unless he tells them to. Nothing moves in Mordekaiser that he has not commanded. Nothing fades. The weakest of them are load-bearing, and he waits without impatience, because impatience requires the possibility of running out of time, and there is no such possibility available to him. Somewhere far above, beneath a fortress at the center of an empire that does not know what it is standing on, a suit of black iron and souls lies exactly where a pale sorceress hid it thousands of years ago. She checks on it. She has been checking on it since before the empire had a name, and she has never once believed she is finished. She is right not to. That was the story of Sahn-Uzal, who conquered the north for a seat at a table that did not exist, and of Mordekaiser, who found out that the table did not exist and built the whole hall himself. Twice slain and thrice born. Still waiting. Sleep well.